The words came out flat, almost bored, the way you'd mentioned the mail hadn't come yet. My wife set 2 glasses of eggnog on the counter and said the seating chart was already finalized for Christmas Eve, and that this year, given everything, it would be easier if I sat in the den instead of the dining room. I stood there in my coat, snow still melting off the shoulders, a box of ornaments under one arm because she'd asked me to bring the ones from the attic. For a moment I thought I'd misheard her. 41 years married. 41 Christmas Eves at that table, or one just like it, and now I was being told there wasn't room. Easier for who? I asked. For everyone, she said, not looking at me, already wiping down a counter that didn't need wiping. You know how you get around my mother, the comments, the questions. Nobody wants a repeat of Easter. Easter had been nothing. I'd asked her mother a simple question about a check that never showed up from the sale of my late father-in-law's boat, and the whole table had gone quiet like I'd said something obscene. That was 6 months ago. I hadn't brought it up since. I'd let it go the way I'd let go of 100 small humiliations over the decades, because that's what you do when you've decided the marriage matters more than being right. I set the box of ornaments on the table. My hands weren't quite steady, though I kept them from showing it. So where exactly am I supposed to sit, I said, while the rest of the family eats? The den has the good chair, she said. Like that settled something. You can watch the game. Nobody's trying to hurt you. I want to be honest about what I felt in that moment, because I've thought about it a great deal since. It wasn't rage. Rage would have been almost a relief. Rage is loud, it announces itself, it gives you something to do with your hands. What I felt was smaller and colder than that. It was the sensation of watching a door close from the inside of the room you're being shut out of. I'd married into a family that measured affection in RSVPs and seating charts, and for 4 decades I had made myself small enough to fit wherever there was space. I had complimented food I didn't care for. I had laughed at jokes about my line of work. 29 years running the parts department at a dealership. Reliable was the word her mother always used, said with the faint condescension of someone who'd married into money and never quite let anyone forget it. Reliable, not smart. Reliable, not interesting. Reliable like a furnace you don't think about until it breaks. I didn't say any of that to my wife. I asked her one more time if she was serious, and when she said, "Please don't make this into something," I understood that the conversation was over before it had properly started. I went up to bed early that night without eating dinner, which she noticed and didn't comment on, which told me everything I needed to know about how long this decision had been coming. The days leading up to Christmas Eve were quiet in a way that felt deliberate. My wife was pleasant, almost cheerful, the particular cheerfulness of someone managing a situation rather than living in it. She reminded me twice that dinner started at 5, as though I might have forgotten I wasn't invited to the part that mattered. My daughter called once, and I could hear in her voice that she already knew that this had been discussed among the women of the family the way weather gets discussed, as an inconvenience to be planned around rather than a decision anyone owed me an explanation for. "It's not permanent, Dad," she said. "It's just Grandma's been stressed. About money, I think. She doesn't want any tension at the table." "What kind of stressed?" I asked. "I don't really know. Something with the ranch. You know how she gets when she doesn't want to talk about something." I did know. I'd known my mother-in-law for 4 decades, and I knew that when she didn't want to talk about something, it was usually because talking about it would require admitting she'd made a mistake, and admitting mistakes was not a skill she'd ever developed. She'd inherited the ranch from her husband, 300 acres out past the county line that had been losing money quietly for a decade, propped up by a rotation of loans and a stubbornness that no banker had ever managed to talk her out of. I didn't think much more about it. I had my own quiet stress those weeks. My knees weren't what they used to be. My pension statements kept arriving with numbers that seemed to shrink a little every quarter. And I was doing the math, the way men my age do, on how many good years might be left and whether I was spending them the way I wanted to. Being told I couldn't sit at my own family's table answered that question in a way I hadn't expected. On the morning of the 23rd, 2 days before Christmas Eve, my bank called. They don't usually call. A polite young man, careful with his words, said they'd flagged unusual activity on one of my accounts and wanted to confirm a few things. I stood in my kitchen with a cup of coffee going cold in my hand and listened to him describe an application submitted 11 days earlier for a home equity line of credit against the house. My house, the one I'd paid off 6 years ago, the one I'd stood in the driveway of the day we got the last mortgage statement and felt, for the first time in my adult life, like a man who owned something outright. "I didn't apply for anything," I said. "I understand, sir. That's why we're calling. The application listed you as a cosigner on the paperwork alongside a Mrs. And he said my mother-in-law's name, and something in my chest went very still, the way water goes still right before it starts to move. I asked him to hold the application, to flag it, to do whatever it took to stop it from going anywhere. He told me it hadn't been approved, that there'd been a discrepancy in the signature verification that had triggered the review in the first place, which was the only reason I was hearing about it at all, rather than finding from a statement 6 weeks down the line. A discrepancy in the signature, meaning someone had tried to forge mine and hadn't done it well enough. I hung up and sat down at the kitchen table, the same table where, 2 days from now, apparently, there wouldn't be a place for me. I called our attorney before I called my wife. I want to be clear about that, because I think it says something about where I'd already arrived, even if I hadn't said the words out loud yet. Our attorney, my attorney, a man I'd used for 2 decades of small business contracts back when I still had ambitions of my own, told me to file a police report immediately, not because he thought it would go anywhere fast, but because a report creates a timestamp, and a timestamp is the difference between this happened to me and prove it. I drove to the station that afternoon. I sat across from a young detective, 30-some years old, who took notes and asked good questions and told me, not unkindly, that identity theft within families was more common than people wanted to believe, and harder to prosecute for exactly that reason, because families protect each other, even the ones who shouldn't be protected. "Do you have any reason to believe your wife was involved?" she asked. I said I didn't know, which was true, and which was its own kind of answer. I didn't tell my wife about any of it that night. I know how that sounds. A man who spent 41 years believing in transparency suddenly holding a card close to his chest, but I'd learned something in that police station that I hadn't fully understood in my kitchen 2 days before. Somebody in that family had used my name, my credit, my house, without asking, and the same week, I had been told there wasn't room for me at the table. Those 2 facts were not unrelated. I didn't know yet exactly how they connected, but I knew enough not to hand anyone advance warning. I spent the rest of that evening at my desk in the garage, the one place in the house that had always been mine, and I started a file. Bank correspondence, the name and badge number of the detective, a printout of the credit application. Once the bank's fraud department finally emailed it to me, and there it was, my signature, close enough to fool a person in a hurry, but not close enough to fool a machine that had been designed specifically not to be fooled. I looked at that signature for a long time. 41 years of holiday cards, of loan documents, of every form a marriage generates. And someone in that family thought they knew my handwriting well enough to counterfeit it. I called my accountant the next morning and asked him to run a full check. Every account, every card, every line of credit tied to my name. He found one more thing, an authorized user request on a business credit line tied to the ranch, submitted through a woman who identified herself as a financial consultant working with my mother-in-law. Not a bank employee, an outside advisor brought in according to the paperwork to help restructure the ranch's debt obligations. My name had been submitted as a guarantor. I hadn't guaranteed anything. I called the number listed for this consultant. A woman answered, brisk and pleasant in the particular way of someone who has learned to sound reassuring while saying nothing at all. "I think there's been some confusion," she said when I explained who I was. "Your mother-in-law indicated she had your full support on this. We were just trying to help the family through a difficult stretch." "I never signed anything," I said. A pause, just half a second too long. "I'll have to look into that," she said. "These things move quickly this time of year. I'm sure it's a simple miscommunication." It was not a simple miscommunication. I knew that the way you know weather is turning before the sky actually changes. Some old animal instinct that had kept me alive through 4 decades of small warning signs I'd chosen, every time, to ignore. I thanked her for her time and hung up, and I sat in my garage with my file getting thicker by the hour, and I thought about the den, and the good chair, and the game I was supposed to watch alone while my family ate 12 feet away. I did not go to the den on Christmas Eve. I want to describe that drive out to the ranch honestly, because people who haven't lived it imagine it as something dramatic. A man storming off with fire in his eyes. It wasn't like that. I made coffee that morning like any other day. I fed the dog. I put on a clean shirt, not because I was dressing for a confrontation, but because some old habit in me still believed in dressing properly for family, even a family that had decided I didn't belong at its table. I put the file in a plain folder, no markings, and set it on the passenger seat, and I drove the 40 minutes out past the county line with the radio off, watching the fields go by white and empty under a sky that couldn't decide if it wanted to snow. The house was lit up when I arrived, every window gold, cars already lining the long gravel drive. I could hear laughter from outside, the particular pitch of a family that has decided, collectively and without much discussion, to have a good time regardless of what's underneath the good time. I sat in my truck for a minute before I went in. I am not ashamed to say that. A man is allowed a minute. My wife saw me first. She was in the kitchen doorway with a serving dish in her hands, and her face did something complicated when she registered that I was there. Not anger exactly, more like the look of someone watching a plan come slightly undone. "You weren't supposed to," she started. "I know what I wasn't supposed to do," I said. My voice came out quieter than I expected. Quieter, I think, than she expected, too. My mother-in-law appeared from the dining room, wiping her hands on an apron, a smile already assembling itself on her face before she'd even fully seen me. That smile faltered the moment she noticed the folder under my arm. "You're early," she said, then recovering. "Or, did we say 5? I lose track." "We didn't say anything," I said. "You told my wife to tell me there wasn't a seat for me tonight, so I brought my own agenda instead." The conversation in the dining room behind her had gone quiet, in the way a room goes quiet when it senses something is about to happen, even before anyone knows what. My daughter appeared in the hallway. My brother-in-law came around from the direction of the living room, a glass of wine in his hand, his expression settling somewhere between amusement and alarm. I set the folder on the entryway table, not the dining table, not yet. I wanted them to have to walk toward it, and I opened it. "2 weeks ago," I said, "somebody submitted a home equity application against my house, using a signature that wasn't mine. 10 days ago, a woman calling herself a financial consultant listed me as a guarantor on a business credit line for this ranch without my knowledge. I have the paperwork. I have a police report. I have a detective's card if anyone would like to call her directly." Nobody moved. My mother-in-law's face had gone the particular color of someone doing very fast arithmetic and not liking any of the answers. "You're overreacting," she said, but there wasn't much conviction in it. "It was going to be temporary. The ranch needed a bridge, that's all, until the spring cattle sale. Your credit was it was the strongest in the family. It made the numbers work." "My credit," I repeated. "Not my consent. There's a difference, and you know there's a difference, because you didn't ask me. You removed me from your table instead, so I wouldn't be around long enough to notice. That's not," my wife started. "Isn't it?" I turned to her. "You told me there wasn't room for me because I asked too many questions." "That's exactly what you said." "Well, I asked one question to a bank employee, and it took him 4 minutes to explain that somebody had tried to use my name to secure $400,000 against a house I own outright. 4 minutes. You had 2 days to tell me, and instead you told me to sit in the den." My daughter's hand had come up over her mouth. My brother-in-law had set his wine glass down very carefully on the hall table, the way people do when they suddenly need both hands free for something, though there was nothing for him to do. "I didn't know the details," my wife said. Her voice had lost its earlier certainty. "Mom said it was just paperwork. She said you'd already agreed, that you two had talked about it." "We never talked about it," I said, "because there was nothing to talk about. Because it never happened." My mother-in-law's composure, the thing she had built an entire lifetime around, was coming apart in real time, and I watched it happen with something that was not quite satisfaction. It was closer to grief. Grief for the family I'd thought I had. Grief for the version of myself who used to believe that patience was the same thing as strength. "You don't understand what it's like," she said, her voice rising. "To watch everything your husband built go under because interest rates and feed prices, and you have no idea the pressure." "I understand pressure," I said. "I understand it well enough that I didn't try to solve mine by stealing someone else's name. There are things you don't do to family. Using their signature without asking is one of them. Telling them they don't deserve a seat at the table so they won't notice is another." The room had filled by now. Cousins, a nephew, someone's teenage son standing frozen in the hallway with his phone half raised like he wasn't sure whether this was the kind of thing you were supposed to film. I didn't raise my voice again. I didn't need to. I had spent 4 decades being the reasonable one, the reliable one, the man who smoothed things over, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let the silence do the work instead of me. "The bank has already frozen the application," I said. "The credit line was never approved. Their fraud team caught the forgery before it went through. I'm not here to bankrupt anyone. I'm here because I refuse to be used as collateral for a problem I wasn't told about, in a family that decided I wasn't worth including in the conversation." My mother-in-law sank into one of the dining chairs. "My chair," I noted, "the one that would have been mine if there'd been room," and put her face in her hands. It should have felt like a victory. It didn't. It felt like watching a house I used to live in finally collapse, slowly, under weight that had been building for years before I ever noticed the cracks. "What happens now?" my wife asked. Her voice had gone very small. "Now," I said, "everything goes through my attorney, not through phone calls at midnight. not through apologies at the dinner table. If your mother wants to explain herself, she can explain it to the detective who's already got my report on her desk. I picked up my folder. I didn't ask anyone to stop me, and no one tried. At the door, I turned back once. My wife was standing where she'd been the whole time, the serving dish long since abandoned on the counter, her eyes wet but her feet planted, like some part of her still expected this to resolve itself the way every other difficult conversation in that family had resolved itself, with silence and time, and everyone quietly agreeing to pretend it hadn't happened. I love this family, I said. I still might, given time. But I won't be someone's insurance policy. I won't be edited out of a room when I'm inconvenient and edited back in when I'm useful. You'll have to decide, all of you, whether you can live with a version of family that doesn't work that way. I already have. I walked out into the cold. Behind me, I could hear my mother-in-law crying and my brother-in-law's voice, low and urgent, already starting the work of trying to explain this away to the rest of the family before dessert. I didn't look back again. I spent Christmas Eve alone in my kitchen, eating a sandwich standing up at the counter, which is not the ending I would have chosen if you'd told me a month earlier how this year would go. But it was quiet in a way I hadn't felt in a long time. Not peaceful, exactly. Just mine. My wife came home 2 days later. She'd been staying with her sister, giving the family time to do whatever families do in the aftermath of a thing like that. Regroup, assign blame, decide collectively on a version of events everyone could live with. She sat across from me at our own kitchen table, the one that had never once had a seating chart, and she looked older than I remembered her looking, though it had only been 3 days. My mother's lawyer called, she said. They're saying it can all be smoothed over, that you'd be dropping the report if the family agrees to repay whatever fees. I'm not dropping anything, I said. This was never about money. Then what is it about? I thought about that question for a long moment because it deserved an honest answer and not the first thing that came to mind. It's about the fact that you told me there wasn't room for me, I said. And you were more right than you knew. Not because the table was full, because I asked questions, and questions were inconvenient to a plan I wasn't part of. I spent 41 years making myself small enough to fit wherever your family had space for me. I'm 63 years old. I don't have 41 more years to spend that way. She didn't argue with that. I think somewhere underneath the fear and the loyalty to her mother, she knew it was true and had known it for longer than either of us wanted to admit. Do you want a divorce? She asked, very quietly. I want to know that if something like this happens again, you'll tell me before the bank does. I said, I want a wife, not a buffer between me and the rest of your family. I don't know yet if that's something you're capable of giving me. I think that's actually the real question. Not whether we stay married, whether we start being honest. She cried, and I let her, and I didn't reach for her hand, not because I didn't want to, but because some things need to sit in a room unresolved for a while before you're allowed to smooth them over again. We didn't decide anything that night. We're still, months later, in the slow work of deciding whether trust, once it's been used as collateral without your knowledge, can be rebuilt into something that holds weight again, or whether some doors, once you've seen them close from the inside, don't ever quite open the same way. My mother-in-law was never charged. The bank's fraud department declined to pursue it once the application was voided, and the detective told me, with a kind of weary honesty I respected, that prosecutors rarely take family financial disputes to trial unless the money actually moves. But the consultant, the woman who'd submitted my name without so much as a phone call, lost her license 2 months later, after a second family filed a nearly identical complaint. I heard about it secondhand, the way you hear most things now, through my daughter, who calls more often these days than she used to, maybe because she's trying to make up for a silence she let stand for too long. I still see my mother-in-law at family gatherings now and then. We are polite. We are not close, and I don't think we ever will be again, and I've made a kind of peace with that, the way you make peace with a room in a house you no longer go into. What I keep coming back to, on the nights I can't sleep, isn't the fraud, or the forged signature, or even the folder I set down on that entryway table. It's the moment in my own kitchen, days before any of it started, when my wife told me there wasn't room for me at a table I'd sat at for 4 decades, and how casually she said it, the way you'd mentioned the mail hadn't come. I think about how long she must have been rehearsing that sentence to be able to say it so lightly. I think about how many other sentences, over the years, I let her rehearse without noticing. I bought a chair for my kitchen table not long after. A good one, sturdy, the kind built to last. It sits at the head of the table now, where I sit every morning with my coffee, in a house where no one gets to tell me there isn't room. That's the part nobody warns you about when you spend a lifetime being the reasonable one. You start to believe reasonable is the same thing as invisible. It isn't. And it took a stranger's forged signature on my own name to finally teach me the difference.